close your eyes. Let the noise of the modern world fade away like mist dissolving in morning light. Feel yourself drifting backward through time, through centuries of stories and legends, through the ages of empire and republic, past the rise of Rome, deeper still into the ancient Mediterranean world. The year is 480 BCE, and you are standing in a valley surrounded by mountains. The air here tastes different, thinner, sharper. You can smell wild thyme and cypress, the mineral scent of limestone cliffs that rise around you like the walls of a natural fortress. This is Laconia, a fertile valley in the southern Peloponnese peninsula of Greece, isolated from the rest of the Hellenic world by ranges of gray-blue mountains. The Taygetus Range rises to the west, its peaks still touched with snow even in summer. To the east, the Parnon Mountains create another barrier, and through the center of this hidden valley flows the Eurotas River. Its water is cold and clear, fed by mountain springs. This is Sparta, not the Sparta of Hollywood films or comic books, not the simplified legend of 300 warriors and their impossible stand. This is the real Sparta, a civilization unlike any other in the ancient world, a society that chose a path so extreme, so uncompromising, that even their Greek neighbors found them strange and frightening. The Spartans called themselves the Spartiates, the equals, though equality among them meant something very different from what we might imagine. They lived in a city without walls, believing that walls bred softness, that true security came not from stone, but from the bodies and discipline of warriors. Their city was not filled with the marble temples and monuments that adorned Athens or Corinth. Sparta was austere, almost deliberately plain, as if beauty itself was a weakness to be avoided. But beneath that plainness lay something extraordinary and terrible, a social experiment that lasted for centuries, a way of life that transformed human beings into weapons, that built a military machine of such efficiency that for generations, the very word Spartan meant invincible. Yet this transformation came at a price so steep that even now, more than 2,000 years later, we struggle to comprehend what was truly sacrificed in the Valley of Laconia. The Spartans themselves left us few written records. They were not a people of poets and philosophers, not builders of libraries or collectors of knowledge. They were laconic, a word that comes from their homeland's name, meaning they spoke little and said much. Their laws were not written down, but passed from generation to generation through memory and custom. What we know of them comes largely from outsiders, from Athenian writers and later historians who looked upon Sparta with a mixture of admiration and horror. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote of them with respect tinged with bewilderment. Thucydides, the great chronicler of the Peloponnesian War, tried to understand the mechanics of their power. Plutarch, writing centuries after Sparta's glory had faded, attempted to reconstruct their way of life, though by then it had already become legend mixed with truth, but entangled with fact. To understand Sparta, we must first understand what it was not. It was not a democracy like Athens, where citizens gathered to debate and vote. It was not a tyranny ruled by a single man's whim. It was not a normal Greek polis, where trade and culture and arts flourished alongside military prowess. Sparta was something else entirely, a state organized around a single principle, the creation and maintenance of the perfect warrior society. Every aspect of Spartan life, from birth to death, from marriage to warfare, from education to old age, was subordinated to this one goal. Citizens did not choose their professions. They did not pursue wealth or comfort or personal ambition. They served the state, and the state demanded everything. In return, the state promised glory, honor, and a kind of immortality. Your name remembered not for what you built or wrote or created, but for how bravely you fought and how well you died. But this was not always so. Sparta was not born as a military state. Once, in the dim and distant past, it had been like other Greek cities, with poets and artisans, with trade and culture. The great poet Alcman composed beautiful verses in archaic Sparta. Craftsmen there created pottery and metalwork that was traded throughout the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence shows us a Sparta that participated fully in the flowering of Greek civilization during the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Then something changed. Slowly, deliberately, over the course of generations, Sparta transformed itself. It turned away from art and commerce, from the things that made other Greek cities rich and famous. It chose instead the path of iron and discipline, of communal devotion and individual subordination. It made itself into a sword, and like a sword, it was strong and sharp and ultimately brittle. The reasons for this transformation are lost to time, buried beneath layers of legend and propaganda. But we can trace the outlines, can see the shape of the choices made and the consequences that flowed from them. And at the heart of it all stands a single figure, perhaps real, perhaps mythical, but certainly powerful in the Spartan imagination. Lycurgus, the lawgiver, the man who supposedly gave Sparta its unique constitution and set on its path toward military supremacy. Whether Lycurgus actually existed is a question that has puzzled historians for millennia. The ancient Greeks themselves could not agree on when he lived. Some placed him in the 9th century BC, others in the 7th. Some said he was a king, others a regent. Still others a simple citizen moved by the gods to reform his city. Plutarch, writing his biography of Lycurgus 600 years after the legendary lawgiver's supposed death, admitted that concerning Lycurgus the lawgiver in general, nothing can be said which is not disputed. But the legend of Lycurgus tells us something true about Sparta, even if the man himself never existed. It tells us that the Spartans believed their way of life was deliberately chosen, carefully designed, divinely inspired. It was not something that evolved naturally, but something imposed, a radical reimagining of what a society could be. And so we return to the valley, to the mountains and the river, to the beginning of our story. We stand in Laconia as the sun sets behind the Taygetus range, painting the sky in shades of bronze and blood. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, a Spartan mother examines her newborn son, and the elders of the city gather to decide if he is strong enough to live. Somewhere, boys no older than 7 are being torn from their families to begin their training. Somewhere, men in crimson cloaks are preparing for war, knowing that to retreat or surrender is to bring dishonor worse than death. This is Sparta. Let us walk together through its history, through its rise and its glory and its eventual fall. Let us try to understand not just the legend, but the reality. Let us see the price of perfection, the cost of creating a society where every citizen was a warrior and every warrior was ready to die. The story begins not with battles or glory, but with a question that every society must answer. How should we live? Sparta's answer to that question was unlike any other in human history. The legend says that Lycurgus traveled far before he reformed Sparta. He journeyed to Crete, where he studied their ancient laws. He sailed to Asia Minor and learned from the philosophers and wise men there. Some accounts even claim he traveled as far as Egypt and Libya, gathering wisdom from every corner of the known world. When he finally returned to Sparta, he came bearing a vision of a perfect society, a city that would be invincible because its citizens would be incorruptible. What Lycurgus found in Sparta was a city in turmoil. The traditional accounts speak of inequality and strife, of rich citizens oppressing the poor, of factions and feuds threatening to tear the city apart. Whether this chaos was real or invented later to justify the radical changes that followed, we cannot know. But the Spartans believed it, and that belief shaped their understanding of their own history. The reforms attributed to Lycurgus were comprehensive and revolutionary. They touched every aspect of life, from government to education, from economics to family structure. At the heart of these reforms was a simple but radical idea, that citizens should be as equal as possible, that differences in wealth and status bred corruption and weakness, and that only through shared hardship and communal devotion could a city become truly strong. First came the political reforms. Sparta would be ruled not by one king but by 2, each checking the other's power. These kings came from 2 royal houses, the Agiads and the Europonids, both claiming descent from Heracles himself. But the king's power was limited. They led the army in war and performed religious duties in peace, but they could not make laws or rule absolutely. Real power lay with the Gerousia, a council of 28 elders, men over the age of 60 who had proven themselves worthy through a lifetime of service. These elders, together with the 2 kings, formed a body of 30 that proposed laws and judged important legal cases. They were elected by the Assembly of Citizens, but once chosen, they served for life, immune to the changing moods of the people. Below the Gerousia was the Apella, the assembly of all Spartan citizens over the age of 30. This assembly could not propose laws, only approve or reject what the Gerousia offered them, and their method of voting was peculiar. They shouted, and the loudest shout determined the outcome. If a decision was unclear, they divided and were counted. It was democracy of a sort, but carefully controlled, channeled, made safe. And overseeing everything were the ephors, 5 magistrates elected annually from among all citizens. The ephors were powerful indeed. They could summon the Gerousia, preside over the assembly, and even prosecute the kings if they overstepped their bounds. The historian Herodotus tells us that each month the kings and the ephors would exchange oaths. The kings swearing to rule according to laws, the ephors swearing to uphold the kingship as long as the kings kept their oath. It was a system of checks and balances that predated by centuries the constitutional governments we know today. But political structure was only the beginning. Lycurgus, according to legend, looked at the inequality of wealth in Sparta and decided that it too must be eliminated. He redistributed the land of Laconia, dividing it into equal plots called kleroi. Each Spartan citizen received a plot that would produce enough to support his household. These plots could not be sold or divided. They passed from father to son, generation after generation, ensuring that no citizen would be too poor or too rich. Of course, someone had to actually work this land, and it would not be the Spartans themselves. They had more important duties: training for war, serving in the army, participating in the governance of the city. The land was worked by the Helots, a subject population bound to soil, required to give half their produce to their Spartan masters. We will return to the Helots later, for their story is crucial to understanding Sparta. For now, it is enough to know that the economic equality of the Spartans rested on the systematic exploitation of others. Lycurgus went further still. He banned gold and silver currency, replacing it with heavy iron bars of little value. This made trade difficult and accumulation of wealth nearly impossible. Spartan citizens were forbidden from engaging in commerce or any craft besides war. They could not be merchants or artisans or anything else that might distract from their primary function. Luxury was forbidden, ostentation was shameful, and simplicity was elevated to a virtue. The Spartans ate together in communal messes called syssitia. Each citizen required to contribute from his land's produce. These were not mere dining halls, but the core of Spartan social life, where bond of camaraderie were forged and maintained. To be expelled from your syssition was to lose your citizenship, to become less than a Spartan. The food was simple, famously so. The Spartan staple was a black broth made from pork, blood, and vinegar that other Greeks found revolting. When a man from Sybaris, a city famous for its luxury, tasted this broth, he reportedly said, "Now I understand why Spartans do not fear death." Even marriage and family life were transformed by the Lycurgan reforms. Young men lived in barracks until the age of 30. Even if they were married, they could visit their wives, but only secretly, briefly, as if they were conducting an affair rather than fulfilling marital duties. The goal was to make a man's primary loyalty to his comrades in his city, not to his household. Love between husband and wife was acceptable, even praise, but it must never supersede duty to Sparta. Children belonged to the state more than to their parents. We will explore the brutal education system in detail soon, but it began at birth with inspection by the city's elders. Weak or deformed infants were supposedly exposed on a mountainside to die, though modern scholars debate how often this actually occurred. What is certain is that from age 7 onward, boys were raised communally, their education designed to produce obedient, disciplined, fearless warriors. All of these reforms, all of these radical changes to society, were supposedly given sanction by the oracle at Delphi. Lycurgus was said to have traveled to the oracle and received divine approval for his constitution. This was crucial, for it meant that to question the Lycurgan system was to question the gods themselves. The laws became sacred, unchangeable, eternal, or so the Spartans claimed. Before implementing his reforms, Lycurgus allegedly made all the citizens swear an oath not to change any of his laws until he returned from a final journey. Then he traveled to Delphi one last time and starved himself to death, ensuring that his laws could never be altered. It is a powerful story, speaking to the Spartan reverence for their own system and their belief that any change would be corruption. The truth, of course, is more complex. The Lycurgan reforms, if they happen at all, likely unfolded over generations, not in a single lawgiver's lifetime. They were the product of historical forces and social pressures, of decisions made and paths taken by many people over many years. But the Spartans preferred their legend. They wanted to believe that their way of life had been given to them complete and perfect, divinely sanctioned and humanly perfected. And what was the purpose of all these reforms? What was Lycurgus, or the historical forces he represented, trying to achieve? The answer, according to the ancient sources, was clear: to create a citizenry that was unified, disciplined, and dedicated entirely to the defense and glory of Sparta. To produce warriors who would be invincible not because of superior weapons or tactics, but because of superior character, because they were willing to endure anything, sacrifice everything for their city. It was a vision of stark beauty, a society where every citizen was equal before the law, where poverty and wealth were eliminated, where men lived simply and honestly, devoted to virtue rather than vice. The philosopher Plato, writing his Republic, was influenced by Sparta's example, even as he criticized some of his practices. The idea that a society could be designed, that human nature could be shaped through law and education, that a city could achieve perfection through discipline and order, this was intoxicating to ancient philosophers. But there was a darker side to this vision, costs that the legend of Lycurgus preferred to ignore. The equality of the Spartans rested on the enslavement of the Helots. The simplicity of Spartan life was maintained through constant vigilance and occasional terror. The unity of purpose required the suppression of individual ambition, creativity, and freedom, and the constant focus on military prowess meant that Sparta contributed little to Greek culture beyond the art of war. The Spartan poet Tyrtaeus, who lived in the 7th century BCE during the Second Messenian War, captured the Spartan ideal in his verses. He wrote the glory of dying in battle, of standing firm in the phalanx, of earning fame through courage. His poems were memorized by Spartan soldiers and sung as they marched to war. One fragment survives. For it is a beautiful thing for a brave man to die, fall in the front ranks while fighting for his homeland. This was the dream of Lycurgus. If he existed, this was the Sparta that would emerge in the shadows of legend into the harsh light of history. A city of warriors, austere and terrible and magnificent. A city that would make other Greeks tremble at the sight of men in crimson cloaks marching in perfect unison. A city that would stand at Thermopylae against impossible odds and would be remembered for millennia. But every dream has its price, and Sparta's price would be paid in ways a lawgiver could never have imagined. Let us follow the life of a Spartan citizen from the beginning, from the moment of birth into the valley of Laconia. Imagine a woman giving birth in one of Sparta's simple stone houses. There are no elaborate decorations here, no murals or imported furniture. The room is austere, functional, but clean and well-maintained. The midwives attending her are experienced and skilled, for Spartan women were renowned for their health and vitality. The child is born a son, and his first cry echoes in the small room. But there is no immediate celebration, no certainty that this infant will be welcomed into the family. First, he must be inspected. The father, or perhaps a representative of the elders, examines the baby carefully. Is he well-formed? Are his limbs strong? Does he cry with vigor? These are the questions that will determine his fate. The ancient sources tell us that weak or deformed infants were taken to the Apothetai, a chasm near the Taygetus Mountains, and left to die. This practice, called exposure, was not unique to Sparta. Many ancient Greek cities practiced it, though perhaps none with the same systematic severity. Modern archaeology has actually investigated the Apothetai and found relatively few infant remains, leading some scholars to suggest that the practice was less common than ancient writers claimed, or that families found ways to avoid it. But even if exposure was rare, the threat of it shaped Spartan life. Every child who survived knew that they had been judged and found acceptable. Every parent knew that the state had a claim on their children that superseded their own. From the very beginning, a Spartan child belonged to Sparta. If the infant was accepted, he would spend his first 7 years in the care of his mother and the household slaves. These early years were different from what would follow, a brief time when affection and family bonds were allowed to flourish. Spartan mothers were not distant or cold. They loved their children, but they also understood that these children would be taken from them, that the boys would be transformed into warriors and the girls into mothers of warriors. Spartan child-rearing practices in these early years were considered unusual by other Greeks. Babies were not swaddled tightly as was common elsewhere, but allowed freedom of movement to develop strong limbs. They were bathed in wine rather than water, supposedly to test their constitution. They were taught not to fear darkness or to cry for food. Even in infancy, the process of hardening had begun. The boys played rough games, learning early that pain was temporary and tears were shameful. They climbed the rocks and hills around Sparta, developing the strength and endurance they would need. They watched their fathers and older brothers, saw the respect given to warriors, and learned what they must become. But they also knew their mother's love, heard stories at bedtime, experienced the warmth of family life. All of this ended on their 7th birthday. The transition was abrupt and deliberate. At age 7, boys were taken from their homes and enrolled in the agoge, the notorious Spartan education system. They would live in barracks with other boys their age, under the supervision of older youths and adult trainers. They would see their families only occasionally. Their childhood, in any normal sense, was over. The word agoge means leading or raising up, and that is exactly what was intended to do, to raise up boys into Spartans. The system was comprehensive, lasting from age 7 to age 30, though the intensity decreased as young men matured and took on military duties. It was designed to be harsh, to winnow out the weak and forge the strong into an unbreakable whole. The boys were organized into groups called ageli, or herds, led by the oldest and most respected boy among them. These groups competed against each other in games, fights, and exercises. Loyalty to your agile was paramount. You ate together, slept together, trained together, fought together. The bonds formed here would last a lifetime, stronger often in family ties. The conditions were deliberately brutal. The boys were given only a single cloak, no matter the season. In winter, they would huddle together for warmth or sleep near fires. They were fed meager rations, not enough to satisfy their hunger. This was intentional. They were expected to steal food to supplement their diet, teaching them cunning and resourcefulness. But if they were caught stealing, they were beaten severely, not for stealing but for being caught, for showing incompetence. A famous story illustrates this perverse logic. A Spartan boy supposedly stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When he was questioned by his trainers, the fox began to bite and claw at his stomach, but the boy remained silent and expressionless, preferring to have his intestines torn rather than admit to being caught. He died from his injuries without having uttered a word. Whether this story is true or not, it reveals what the Spartans valued: endurance, silence in the face of pain, and devotion to the code even unto death. The boys went barefoot year-round, developing calluses that would serve them well on long marches. They wore their hair short until they became full citizens, marking them as still in training. They slept on pallets they made themselves from reeds gathered from the Helots River, breaking the reeds with their bare hands without using any cutting tool. Every aspect of their life was designed to cultivate hardness, to eliminate softness and weakness. But the agoge was not just about physical hardship. The boys were also educated, though in the Spartan manner. They learned to read and write, but only the basics. As Plutarch noted, their education was designed to make them obedient and enduring, able to conquer in war. They learned poetry, especially the martial verses of Tertius that celebrated death in battle. They learned music, particularly the flute and war songs, for the Spartans believed that music made men brave and disciplined. They learned to speak in a laconic style, saying much with few words, eliminating unnecessary speech. When Philip II of Macedon sent a message to Sparta threatening, "If I invade Laconia, I will drive you out," the Spartans replied with a single word: "If." This economy of language was cultivated from childhood, part of the broader Spartan ethos that valued action over words, substance over show. Dancing was also part of their training, not the graceful dances of Athens, but vigorous martial dances performed in armor, teaching them to move in formation, to keep rhythm with their fellows. The Pyrrhic dance, performed at festivals, was a mock battle in dance form, boys leaping and spinning, attacking and defending to the rhythm of flutes. It was beautiful and terrible to watch, this dance of future warriors, and they learned to endure pain. They were beaten regularly with whips, sometimes as punishment, sometimes simply as training. Once a year, at the altar of Artemis Orthia, boys would be whipped until the blood flowed, competing to see who could endure the most without crying out. This ritual, which became a spectacle attended by crowds in later centuries, was supposed to honor the goddess and prove the boys' courage. Some, it was said, died under the lash rather than show weakness. As the boys grew older, the training intensified. They learned weapons handling, not just the spear and sword of the hoplite, but also how to wrestle, how to use terrain, how to march in formation for hours without breaking stride. They learned to endure thirst and hunger, how to sleep lightly and wake ready to fight, how to care for their equipment, and trust their lives to the man beside them. At age 12, the boys were assigned an older male lover, a young man in his 20s who would serve as mentor and protector. This institution, called pederasty, was common in ancient Greece, but took on a particular character in Sparta. The relationship was meant to be educational and inspirational, the older lover teaching the younger through example, creating an additional bond of loyalty and love that would strengthen the army. If a boy showed cowardice, his lover would be punished as well, ensuring that these relationships reinforced rather than distracted from military virtue. The ancient sources are somewhat coy about the sexual nature of these relationships, though it seems clear they were sometimes physical. What mattered to Spartans was that they served the state's purpose, creating networks of loyalty and inspiring boys to acts of courage to win their lovers' praise. Plutarch tells us that lovers and their boys would often stand together in battle, each fighting more fiercely because the other was watching. By age 14 or 15, the boys were already formidable. They had spent half their lives training for war. They could march all day and fight all night. They could endure cold and heat, hunger and thirst, pain and fear. But there was one more trial they had to pass, one more test of their readiness: the Cryptia. The Cryptia was a secret rite of passage, and much about it remains mysterious even to historians. What we know comes from fragmentary accounts in ancient sources, and these accounts are sometimes contradictory, but the outline is clear enough, and it is chilling. Selected boys, usually around age 18, were sent out alone into the countryside with nothing but a knife and a cloak. They were to survive by their wits, hiding during the day and emerging at night. Their mission was twofold: to test their ability to survive independently and to hunt and kill Helots, the enslaved population that worked Spartan lands. This was not random murder, but state-sanctioned terror, designed to keep the Helot population cowed and fearful. The boys would target Helots who seemed strong or rebellious, potential leaders of revolt. They would strike at night and disappear, ghosts in the darkness. It taught the boys to kill without hesitation, to see the Helots as less than human, as enemies that must be suppressed. And it reminded the Helots that they lived only at Spartan sufferance, that death could come for them at any moment from the shadows. Not all scholars agree that the Cryptia involved killing Helots. Some argue that it was simply a survival test, a wilderness ordeal. But the ancient sources, particularly Plutarch, are fairly clear that it involved violence against Helots. Whether every boy participated or only selected ones, whether it happened annually or only in times of tension, these details are lost. What remains is a shadow of the practice, dark evidence of how Sparta maintained its grip on a hostile population. At age 20, if a young man had survived the Goge and proven himself worthy, he became an Iron, a young warrior who would continue training while also helping to oversee the younger boys. He was not yet a full citizen, but he was close. He could let his hair grow long, a mark of status among Spartans. He had survived what many consider the harshest military training system ever devised. And yet, his education was not complete. He would live in barracks, train daily, and serve in the army for another decade before finally achieving full citizenship at age 30. The years between 20 and 30 marked a transition in a Spartan man's life. He was no longer a boy in training, but not yet a full citizen with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. He was, in essence, a weapon being honed to its sharpest edge, a warrior learning not just how to fight, but how to win, how to lead, how to embody the Spartan ideal in every action. These young men, the Irenes, occupied a unique position in Spartan society. They continued their own training, while supervising the younger boys in the Goge, responsible for their discipline and instruction. It was a system of layered authority, where those just a few years older commanded those below them, creating a hierarchy based on age and proven worth. The Irenes could be harsh, even brutal, with the boys under their care, for they knew that weakness tolerated in training could mean death in battle. Military training in these years became increasingly sophisticated. The young warriors learned not just individual combat skills, but the complex choreography of the phalanx, the dense formation of spear and shield that was the foundation of Greek warfare. To understand Sparta, one must understand the phalanx, for it shaped everything about how the Spartans fought and why their training was so rigorous. The Greek phalanx was a formation typically 8 men deep, with soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping. Each man carried a large round shield called a hoplon or aspes, from which comes the term hoplite. This shield was held in the left hand, protecting the bearer's left side and the right side of the man to his left. A long spear, the dory, about 7 to 9 feet long, was held in the right hand and thrust overhand or underhand at the enemy. The phalanx was a collective weapon. Individual heroics meant nothing if the formation broke. A man alone, no matter how skilled, could be surrounded and killed. But men in formation, shields locked together, spears bristling outward like the spines of some great beast, were nearly unstoppable. The key was maintaining cohesion, advancing or holding ground as a single unit, never breaking ranks, never yielding to fear or pain. This required extraordinary discipline and trust. You had to trust that the man beside you would not flee, leaving your right side exposed. You had to trust that the man behind you would step forward if you fell, that the formation would hold even as friends died around you. You had to subordinate every instinct for self-preservation to the collective good. This is why the Spartans spent decades training, why their entire society was organized around creating men who could stand in the phalanx without wavering. The young warriors drilled endlessly in formation movements, advancing in step, maintaining the line even over rough ground, wheeling left or right as a unit, stopping and starting together. They learned to march to the rhythm of flutes, which kept them in step and made the phalanx move as one organism. They practiced the othismos, the push, when 2 phalanxes crashed together, and each side tried to physically drive the other back through sheer muscle and determination. They learned to keep their eyes forward, to resist the temptation to look down at fallen comrades or back to see if help was coming. They learned to control their breathing, to conserve energy during long battles, to recognize the moment when an enemy line was about to break. They learned that battles were often decided not by killing all the enemy, but by breaking their cohesion, by making them turn and run, at which point the slaughter would truly begin as the fleeing mob was cut down from behind. Physical conditioning continued to be paramount. The warriors ran long distances in full armor, building the endurance needed for campaigns that might last months. They practiced swimming, useful for crossing rivers or escaping after coastal raids. They wrestled constantly, for if you lost your spear and sword in battle, you might have to grapple with an enemy hand to hand. And they continued to live simply, hardening themselves against comfort and luxury. But they were also allowed some pleasures now. They could attend the syssitia, the communal messes, though they could not yet be full members. They could court young women, though marriage was still ahead of them. They could begin participating in the social life of Sparta, attending festivals and religious ceremonies, watching the dances and competitions, slowly being integrated into the adult community. At age 25, if a young man had proven himself in training and shown promise in leadership, he might be allowed to marry. However, the marriage was conducted in a strange and secretive manner that revealed much about Spartan values. There was no elaborate wedding ceremony, no public celebration. Instead, the young woman, her head shaved and dressed in men's clothing, would wait in a dark room. The young man would sneak away from his barracks, consummate the marriage briefly, and then return to his communal life. This pattern would continue even after marriage. The young man still lived in barracks, still ate in his mess hall, still spent his days in training. He would visit his wife secretly, as if they were conducting an illicit affair. Children might be conceived before the couple had ever seen each other in full daylight. The rationale, according to Plutarch, was that these brief encounters would keep desire sharp and make the resulting children more vigorous. But the real purpose was clear: to ensure that a man's primary loyalty remained with his fellow soldiers, not with his household. The Spartans believed that men who became too attached to their wives and children might fight less recklessly, might value survival over glory. They wanted warriors who would die gladly for Sparta, who would charge into hopeless situations without hesitation. A man mourning sons he rarely saw was preferable to a man desperate to return to a beloved family. At age 30, finally, a Spartan man achieved full citizenship. He was allowed to live with his wife and children, though he was still required to eat most meals in his position. He could attend the assembly and vote on matters of state. He could, if chosen, serve on juries or as an ephor. He was, at last, one of the homoi, the equals of full Spartan warrior. But even this elevation came with requirements. To remain a citizen in good standing, a man had to continue his military training, contribute to his mess from his land's produce, and be ready to march to war at a moment's notice. Those who could not afford their contributions could lose their citizenship, becoming hypomyons, inferiors, still free, but no longer full members of the elite. It was another mechanism of control, ensuring that even citizens constantly strove to maintain their status. The active military service of Spartan lasted until age 60, an extraordinarily long period compared to other Greek cities. Even in their 40s and 50s, Spartan warriors were expected to fight, and many did so with distinction. Age brought experience and wisdom, qualities valuable in the chaos of battle. The older warriors steadied the younger ones, provided leadership, and showed by example what it meant to be Spartan. After 60, a man could retire from active service and was eligible for positions of high honor, particularly election to the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. This was a capstone of Spartan life. To have survived decades of training in warfare, to have proven oneself again and again, and finally to help guide the city in one's old age. Death, when it came for a Spartan warrior, was ideally to happen in battle. The most honored graves in Sparta were reserved for two categories: women who died in childbirth and men who died in war. These were the deaths that served the state, that produced citizens or defended them. To die in bed of old age was acceptable but not glorious. The true Spartan hoped to fall with his face to the enemy, his wounds in front, his place in the phalanx maintained until the last breath. Mothers sending their sons to war would hand them their shields and say, "Return with this or on it," meaning come back victorious or come back dead. To lose one's shield, to throw it away in flight, was the ultimate disgrace. The shield was heavy and cumbersome for a fleeing man, so abandoning it was a clear sign of cowardice. A Spartan who returned without his shield could be stripped of citizenship, marked as a trembler, and subjected to systematic humiliation for the rest of his life. The system was designed to create not just skilled fighters, but men psychologically incapable of retreat or surrender. From age 7 onward, every lesson, every punishment, every reward reinforced the same message. Your life belongs to Sparta. Your glory comes from serving the state, and death in battle is preferable to life with dishonor. It was indoctrination on a scale rarely matched in human history, and for centuries it worked. The Spartans who emerged from this system were formidable indeed. They could endure hardships that broke other men. They could maintain discipline in situations where other armies dissolved into chaos. They fought not for pay or plunder or personal glory, but for their city and their code and the approval of their peers. They were in many ways the perfect soldiers, but they were also men molded so thoroughly that they struggled to be anything else. They produced no great art, no philosophy of note, no literature that has survived. They were brilliant tacticians, but poor strategists, able to win battles but less skilled at diplomacy or long-term planning. They were feared by their enemies and admired by many Greeks, but they were also often alone, unable to work easily with allies who did not share their rigid code. The Agoge created warriors. Whether it created good men, whether it created good society, these are questions that troubled even the ancient Greeks who witnessed Sparta at its height. For now, we have followed a Spartan boy from birth through the brutal decades of training to full citizenship. We have seen what the system demanded and what it produced, but we have not yet addressed the foundation on which this entire edifice rested, the dark secret at the heart of Spartan society. To understand Sparta, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The entire Spartan system, the military prowess, the equality among citizens, the leisure to train constantly for war, all of it rested on the backs of the Helots, a subjected population held in a state that was something between serfdom and slavery. The story of Sparta is incomplete, dishonest even without the story of the Helots. The word helot likely comes from the Greek word meaning to capture, and that is essentially what they were, a conquered people forced to work the land for their Spartan masters. The Helots were primarily descended from the Messenians, inhabitants of the fertile region to the west of Laconia, whom the Spartans conquered in a series of brutal wars in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. The Messenian Wars were foundational to Spartan identity. The First Messenian War, fought sometime around 740 to 720 BC, ended with Sparta's conquest of the rich territory of Messenia. The Messenians became Helots, required to work the land and give half their produce to Sparta, but they did not accept their subjugation peacefully. The Second Messenian War, around 685 to 668 BC, was a desperate revolt by the Helots against their enslavement. For years, they fought with surprising success, led by a figure named Aristomenes, who became a legendary hero to the Messenians and a nightmare to the Spartans. The war nearly destroyed Sparta, pushed its armies to the brink of defeat, and forced the Spartans to call on allies from other Greek cities for help. Tertius, the poet we mentioned earlier, composed his martial verses during this war, tried to inspire Spartan soldiers who were wavering, who were considering retreat. His poems worked, or at least the Spartans eventually won, and Messenia was reconquered. But the near disaster of that war shaped Sparta forever. The city became obsessed with military readiness, paranoid about internal threats, and willing to employ systematic terror to keep the Helots subdued. The Helots outnumbered the Spartans significantly, perhaps by as much as 7-1. Ancient sources suggest that there might have been only about 8,000 to 10,000 full Spartan citizens at Sparta's peak, ruling over a Helot population of perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 or more. The exact numbers are debated, but the ratio was clearly lopsided, and the Spartans knew it. They lived in constant fear of Helot revolt, and this fear influenced every aspect of their society. They were required to wear dogskin caps and simple garments that marked their status. We the Helots outnumbered the Spartans significantly, perhaps by as much as 7-1. Ancient sources suggest that there might have been only about 8,000 to 10,000 full Spartan citizens at Sparta's peak, ruling over a Helot population of perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 or more. The exact numbers are debated, but the ratio was clearly lopsided, and the Spartans knew it. They lived in constant fear of Helot revolt, and this fear influenced every aspect of their society, subjected to regular humiliations designed to reinforce their inferiority. Plutarch reports that Helots were forced to drink unmixed wine until they were disgustingly drunk, then displayed to Spartan youth as examples of the degradation of intoxication. They were beaten annually, even if they had done nothing wrong, simply to remind them that they were enslaved. And each autumn, the Spartans declared war on the Helots. This was not a figure of speech, but a formal religious and legal declaration. By declaring war, the Spartans made it acceptable in the eyes of the gods to kill Helots without incurring blood guilt. It was during these annual war declarations that the Cryptia, which we discussed earlier, would hunt and kill Helots who seemed dangerous or rebellious. The relationship between Spartans and Helots was complex and contradictory. Helots worked Spartan land, making it possible for citizens to train full-time for war. Helots also accompanied the Spartans to battle, serving as attendants, carrying supplies, and sometimes fighting as light armed troops. A Helot might serve the visual, dark forest at night, shadowy figures moving through trees, sense of menace and fear, moonlight filtering through branches. Spartan warrior for years, developing a relationship that was not quite friendship, but more than mere master and slave. Some Helots were even offered freedom in exchange for military service. These freed Helots, called Neodemodius, occupied an ambiguous social position. Free but not citizens, useful to Sparta but never fully trusted. It was a way of rewarding loyalty and creating a buffer class between full Spartans and enslaved Helots, but also meant that some Helots had hope of eventual freedom, which perhaps made the system more stable by offering an escape valve for the most capable and ambitious among them. Despite the systematic oppression, or perhaps because of it, Helot culture survived. The Messenians maintained their identity, their language, their stories of resistance. They remembered Aristomenes and other heroes of the failed revolts. They passed down their history in secret, waiting for the day when they might be free again. This cultural persistence would eventually matter centuries later when Sparta finally weakened and the Helots seized their chance. The Helots' presence also meant that Sparta could never truly relax. The Spartans could not afford long overseas campaigns that would leave Laconia undefended. They were reluctant to arm Helots extensively or train them in military skills, fearing what those weapons and skills might be turned to. They had to maintain constant vigilance, constant readiness for internal as well as external threats. This paranoia shaped Spartan foreign policy. Sparta was often reluctant to intervene in distant conflicts, preferring to maintain its grip on the Peloponnese rather than seek empire abroad. When they did fight far from home, they had to leave sufficient forces behind to watch the Helots. It was a strategic weakness that Sparta's enemies sometimes tried to exploit, attempting to foment Helot revolts to distract Spartan armies. The moral dimension of Helotage troubled even some ancient Greeks. Critias, an Athenian, wrote that in Sparta, the free were most free and the enslaved most enslaved, recognizing that Spartan liberty rested on profound unfreedom for others. The philosopher Aristotle criticized the Helot system as unstable and unjust, noting that it led to constant revolts and that no other Greek city had such problems with its subject populations. But most Spartans seem to have accepted Helotage as natural and necessary. They were raised from childhood to see Helots as inferior, as natural subordinates. The system was sanctified by religion, embedded in law, defended by force. To question it would be to question the entire Spartan way of life, and that was unthinkable. There are occasional glimpses in the ancient sources of individual relationships that transcended the brutality of the system. A Spartan might praise a Helot for loyalty or bravery. A Helot might genuinely mourn a fallen master. These moments of humanity existed within the structure of oppression, neither justifying it nor fully negating it, simply reminding us that history is made by complex human beings, not by abstractions. The Helots paid the price for Spartan military excellence. Their labor, their subjugation, their constant fear, these are the fuel that powered the Spartan war machine. Every hour a Spartan spent training with spear and shield was an hour a Helot spent plowing or harvesting or herding. Every bronze breastplate, every crimson cloak, every sharpened blade was produced with resources extracted from Helot toil. And when Spartans died gloriously in battle, as their culture praised and their training prepared them to do, it was often Helots who carried their bodies from the field, who brought them home to Laconia, who dug their graves. The glory belonged to Sparta, but the grief, like the labor, was shared by all. We cannot and should not sanitize this aspect of Spartan society. The Helots were enslaved, oppressed, and terrorized. No amount of admiration for Spartan military prowess can erase that fact. The Spartan achievement, such as it was built on systematic injustice, and that injustice was not incidental but central to how Sparta functioned. At the same time, we should not pretend that Sparta was unique in its use of forced labor. Slavery was ubiquitous in the ancient world. Athens, which we often celebrate for its democracy and culture, was also a slave society, with perhaps a third of its population enslaved. The difference was that Athenian slaves came from various backgrounds and were not an organized, ethnically distinct population living in constant readiness to revolt. The Helots were something different, more dangerous to Sparta, and more conscious of their potential power. This tension between Spartans and Helots, between the free and the enslaved, would define much of Spartan history. It would limit Spartan ambitions, shape Spartan strategy, and ultimately contribute to Spartan decline. But in the period we are examining, the mid to late 5th century BCE, the system still held. The Spartans were at their peak, their warriors the best in Greece, their phalanx seemingly invincible. And they were about to face the greatest test of their power, the moment when their decades of training and their culture of discipline would be put to the ultimate challenge. They were about to march north to a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, to a place called Thermopylae, where a small force would try to hold back an empire. Before we reach the battlefield, we must complete our understanding of Spartan society by examining another group who occupied an ambiguous position in the social hierarchy, the perioikoi, the dwellers around. These were free inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia who were not Spartan citizens, but also not enslaved like the Helots. They lived in their own communities, primarily in the less fertile areas and along the coast, and they occupied a crucial middle ground in Spartan society. The perioikoi were free to engage in trade and crafts, activities forbidden to the Spartans themselves. They were blacksmiths and potters, merchants and shipbuilders, providing the economic services that a functioning society requires but that the Spartans disdained. They produced the weapons and armor that Spartan warriors used, the pottery for storing food, the ships for occasional naval ventures. In this way, they were essential to Sparta's functioning, even if they lacked political rights in the Spartan state. They were required to fight in Spartan wars, serving the phalanx alongside the Spartans, and by all accounts they did so competently. In battle, a perioikos might stand shoulder to shoulder with a Spartan citizen, both facing the same dangers, both equally crucial to maintaining the formation. Yet when the army returned home, the social distance would reassert itself. The Spartan would return to his mess hall and his communal life of leisure and training, while the perioikos would return to his workshop or farm or ship. The perioikoi seem to have accepted this arrangement with relatively little resistance. They enjoyed protection from Sparta's military might, a share in Sparta's glory, and freedom from the onerous demands of the agoge. They could accumulate wealth, pursue crafts and trades, raise their families in relative peace. It was not a bad bargain, especially when they looked at the Helots and saw how much worse their situation could have been. Some perioikoi apparently achieved considerable prosperity. Archaeological evidence from perioikoi settlements shows comfortable houses, fine pottery, and evidence of trade networks extending beyond Laconia. They were not oppressed in the way the Helots were, though they were certainly subordinate to the Spartans in the political and social hierarchy. The existence of the perioikoi reveals something important about Sparta. Despite its reputation for austere self-sufficiency, Sparta required an economic infrastructure it could not itself provide. The Spartan ideal of the citizen warrior who owned land but did not work it, who had leisure for constant training but no involvement in commerce or craft, was only possible because other people performed those necessary functions. Sparta was thus not a simple society, but a complex three-tiered system. At the top were the Spartiates, the full citizens, numbering perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 adult males at their peak. In the middle were the perioikoi, numbering perhaps 20,000 to 30,000, providing economic functions and military support. At the bottom were the Helots, perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 or more, providing agricultural labor under conditions of subjugation and fear. This structure was stable for a long time, but it was also rigid. The number of full Spartan citizens could not easily be increased. You had to be born to Spartan parents, survive the infantile selection, complete the agoge, and maintain your contributions to your mess hall. If you lost your citizenship through poverty or cowardice, there was no easy path to regaining it. Over time, this meant that the number of Spartiates slowly declined, as casualties in war, failure to produce male heirs, and economic difficulties removed families from the citizen roles. By contrast, Athens could grant citizenship to useful foreigners, could elevate freed slaves, had more flexible social structures that allow for mobility and growth. Sparta's very rigidity, its insistence on perfection of the system Lycurgus had supposedly created, made it unable to adapt to changing circumstances. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the period we are examining, Sparta was still strong, its citizen numbers still robust, its military reputation unmatched. The social control that maintained this hierarchy was not just military, but cultural and religious as well. Spartan religious life was rich and complex, centered on numerous shrines and festivals that reinforced social bonds and reminded all of their proper places. The gods were understood to favor Sparta, to have blessed the Lycurgan system, to demand the maintenance of tradition. Before any military campaign, the Spartans would conduct elaborate sacrifices and consult omens. They would not march if the omens were unfavorable, even if this meant delays or missed opportunities. This religiosity was not weakness, but another form of discipline, subordinating even military necessity to divine will. And since the priests interpreting the omens were Spartan citizens, often from the royal families, this system also provided a check on rash decisions, a way for communities' wisdom to restrain hot-headed kings or ambitious efforts. Festivals provided breaks in the harsh routine of military training and brought the entire community together. The Gymnopedia, held in the heat of summer, featured choirs of boys, men, and elders singing and dancing in honor of Apollo. The Hyacinthia, lasting several days, commemorated the youth Hyacinthus whom Apollo accidentally killed, and included both mourning and celebration. The Carnea, held before military campaigns, featured mock battles and races, appeasing Apollo Carneus and asking his blessing on the coming war. These festivals were not mere entertainment. They reinforced the age-based hierarchies of Spartan society, reminded all of the gods' favor, and provided opportunities for the community to affirm its values and identity. They were moments when the harsh discipline of daily life could be temporarily relaxed, when beauty and joy were allowed alongside duty and rigor. Spartan women, whom we have not yet fully examined, played crucial roles in these religious festivals. They sang hymns, participated in processions, and performed rituals that men could not. This religious prominence reflected the unusual status of women in Sparta, which differed markedly from their position in other Greek cities. Spartan women were not secluded in the home as Athenian women were. They exercised publicly, competed in athletic contests, and managed their households and properties with considerable autonomy, especially since their husbands lived in barracks until age 30. They were educated, though not through the agoge, and were renowned for their sharp wit and forthright manner. The purpose of their physical training was to make them strong mothers who would bear healthy children for Sparta. Lycurgus, according to legend, believed that strong mothers produce strong sons, and so he required that girls exercise and maintain physical fitness. The sight of Spartan women running and wrestling, wearing short tunics that scandalized other Greeks, was one of the many things that made Sparta seem strange and somewhat barbaric to outsiders. Spartan women were also notorious for their harsh attitude toward cowardice. Plutarch records numerous sayings attributed to Spartan mothers and wives, many of which revolve around the theme that death in battle is preferable to survival with dishonor. A mother handing her son his shield and saying with this or on this is the most famous, but there are others. One Spartan mother, told that her son had died bravely, reportedly said simply, "He was my son." Another, whose son survived a battle where many died, asked, "Was he not worthy to die for Sparta?" Whether these particular anecdotes are true or not, they reflect something real about Spartan culture. Women were expected to send their sons and husbands to war without visible grief, to prize honor over life, to embody the same harsh virtues that the men displayed. This was the cost of their relative freedom and status. They were not ornaments or property, but partners in the Spartan project, mothers of warriors, enforcers of the code. Some Spartan women achieved considerable independence and wealth, especially in later periods when men died in wars and women inherited property. By the 4th century BCE, women controlled a significant portion of Spartan land, a fact that other Greeks found shocking and that some ancient writers blamed for Sparta's decline. But that is a story for later. For now, we have assembled all the pieces of the Spartan puzzle. We understand political structure with its dual kings, Gerousia, Epirus, and assembly. We have followed a boy through the brutal decades of the agoge to citizenship. We have examined the Helots who made the system possible through their subjugation. We have seen the perioikoi who provided economic functions, and the women who perpetuated the population and the culture. We have glimpsed the religious life that sanctified the social order and the festivals that relieved its harshness. We are ready now to see the society in action, to watch the Spartan military machine operate at its peak. We are ready for the moment that would define Sparta in historical imagination more than any other, the stand at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and their allies would face the might of the Persian Empire. But before we march to that fateful pass, take a moment to breathe, to reflect. We have traveled deep into an alien way of life, into a society so different from our own that it is sometimes difficult to believe these were real people who lived and loved and suffered and died. They were, though, every harsh detail we have examined, every brutal practice, every sacrifice demanded. These are the daily reality for thousands of human beings who knew no other way. Let that knowledge settle. And when you are ready, we will continue our journey into flames of history. The year is 480 BC. After decades of expansion under Cyrus the Great and his son Cambyses, the Persian Empire under King Xerxes, I have become the largest empire the world has yet seen. It stretches from Egypt to India, from the Caucasus to the Arabian Sea, encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, and cultures under the rule of the King of Kings. And now, Xerxes has turned his attention to Greece. This is not Persia's first attempt to conquer Greece. 10 years earlier, in 490 BCE, Xerxes' father Darius had sent an expedition across the Aegean. That invasion had ended in disaster at the Battle of Marathon, where the Athenians and their allies had defeated the Persian forces through superior tactics and desperate courage. But Persia was not accustomed to accepting defeat. Xerxes had spent years preparing a new invasion on a scale that would dwarf his father's attempt. The numbers that ancient sources provide for Xerxes' army are fantastical, sometimes claiming millions of soldiers. Modern historians believe the actual number was likely between 100,000 and 200,000 troops, still an enormous force by ancient standards, perhaps the largest army yet assembled in human history. It included Persians and Medes, Egyptians and Phoenicians, Indians and Ethiopians, a cosmopolitan host representing the diversity of the empire. The navy was equally impressive, with perhaps 600 to 1,000 ships drawn from Phoenicia, Egypt, and the Greek cities of Asia Minor that were already under Persian control. Against this massive force, the Greek city-states were divided and unprepared. Many Greeks, especially in the north, submitted to Xerxes without fighting, giving the traditional tokens of earth and water that signified acceptance of Persian rule. Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful city-states, attempted to organize resistance, but old rivalries and jealousies made coordination difficult. Many Greeks believed resistance was futile, that the might of Persia was simply too great to oppose. But Sparta and Athens decided to fight. The Athenians, having tasted victory at Marathon, were determined not to submit. The Spartans, believing themselves the finest warriors in Greece, could not accept foreign domination without betraying everything their society stood for. Together, they formed the core of a defensive alliance, the Hellenic League, though it included fewer than 30 city-states of the more than 700 in Greece. The Greek strategy was to delay the Persian advance long enough for the city-states to mobilize their full forces and for the Persian supply lines to become stretched and vulnerable. The geography of Greece favored this approach. Northern Greece was a land of mountains and narrow passes, places where a small force might hold off a much larger one, at least temporarily. The Greeks identified two key defensive positions: the Pass of Thermopylae on land and the Straits of Artemisium at sea. These positions were near each other, allowing the Greek army and navy to support each other. If the Persians could be delayed at these choke points, if the Greek navy could challenge Persian control of the sea, then perhaps, just perhaps, the invasion could be stopped or at least blunted. Command of the Greek forces was given to Sparta in recognition of its military reputation. King Leonidas I of Sparta, a man in his 50s, a veteran of previous conflicts, would lead the army at Thermopylae. He was of the Aegean royal house, had completed the Agoge like any other Spartan, and had proven himself in battle before inheriting the throne. He was not a military genius or a charismatic leader of the type that dominates popular imagination. He was, instead, exactly what a Spartan king should be: competent, disciplined, devoted to the code, willing to do his duty no matter the cost. Leonidas selected 300 Spartans to accompany him to Thermopylae. This number is famous, immortalized in legend and literature, but we should be clear about what it represented. These 300 were not the entire Spartan army, or even a random selection of warriors. They were an elite unit, chosen specifically by Leonidas, and significantly, they were all men who had living sons. This last detail is crucial. Leonidas was preparing for a mission from which he might not return, and he wanted men whose family lines would continue even if they died. The 300 Spartans did not march alone. They were accompanied by their Helot attendants, perhaps 900 of them, who carried supplies and would assist in battle. They were joined by about 700 Thespians, citizens of a small city who proved themselves among the bravest of Greeks. There were 400 Thebans, whose loyalty was questionable and who may have been taken as hostages as much as allies. And there were contingents from several other cities: Mantinea, Tegea, Mycenae, Phlius, and others, bringing the total Greek force at Thermopylae to perhaps 7,000 men, though some ancient sources suggest different numbers. This force marched north in August of 480 BCE, as the Persian army was advancing through Thessaly. They reached Thermopylae, the hot gates, named for the thermal springs in the area, and took up positions to block the pass. Thermopylae in 480 BCE was a much narrower passage than the wide road that exists there today. Centuries of silt deposition from the Spercheios River have pushed the coastline northward, but in antiquity, the sea came right up to the cliffs, leaving only a narrow track between water and mountain. At its narrowest points, the pass was perhaps only 15 meters wide enough for a cart or a few men walking abreast, but not wide enough for a large army to deploy. It was a perfect place for a small force to hold off a large one. The Persians could not use their superior numbers to flank or surround the Greeks. They would have to attack straight on, funneling their troops into a narrow frontage where they would face the Greek phalanx in the most disadvantageous possible circumstances. If the Greeks could hold the pass, they could delay the Persian advance for days or even weeks. The Greeks found an old defensive wall at the middle gate of the pass, built by the Phocians years earlier to protect against invasion from Thessaly. They rebuilt this wall, strengthening it as much as time allowed. Behind this wall, they waited for the Persians to arrive. When Xerxes reached Thermopylae and saw the small Greek force blocking his way, he was reportedly amused. According to Herodotus, he sent scouts to observe the Greeks, and they reported strange behavior. The Spartans, having drawn lots for who would guard the wall that day, were outside the fortification, exercising and combing their long hair. This seemed bizarre to the Persians, who could not understand why men about to face battle would be concerned with grooming. Xerxes consulted Demaratus, a former Spartan king who had been exiled and now advised the Persian court. Demaratus explained that Spartans prepared their hair for death, making themselves beautiful before battle as a final act of pride and defiance. He warned Xerxes that these men would not flee, that they would fight with a courage and skill that would shock the Persian forces. Xerxes reportedly did not believe him. The Persian king waited 4 days, apparently expecting the Greeks to see the size of his army and retreat. When they did not, he sent his troops to attack. The Battle of Thermopylae had begun. The first wave of attackers were Medes and Scythians, subjects of Persia sent to overwhelm the Greeks through sheer numbers. They advanced into the pass and met the Greek phalanx. What happened next was a slaughter, but not the one Xerxes expected. The Persians fought with courage, but they were not prepared for the discipline and coordinated violence of the phalanx. The Greeks stood shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears thrusting in unison. The Persians, armed with shorter spears and wicker shields, could not reach the Greeks without getting impaled. They could not flank the phalanx because the pass was too narrow. They could not break the formation because the Greeks did not break. Wave after wave of Persian troops advanced and were cut down. Bodies piled up in the pass, making the footing treacherous. The Greeks rotated fresh warriors to the front as those who had been fighting grew tired, maintaining the strength of the line. They employed a tactic where they would pretend to retreat, and when the Persians pursued eagerly, the Greeks would suddenly turn and reform their phalanx, catching the Persians disorganized and slaughtering them. The Persian casualties were severe. Exact numbers are impossible to know, but Herodotus suggests that thousands died in the first days fighting alone. The Greeks, protected by their armor and shields and fighting in formation, suffered relatively few losses. Xerxes, watching from a vantage point overlooking the battle, reportedly leapt from his throne 3 times in anxiety for his army. On the second day, Xerxes tried again, this time sending his elite troops, the Immortals, the royal guard of 10,000 men, so called because their number was always maintained at exactly 10,000, casualties immediately replaced. If any troops could break the Greek line, it would be these. But the Immortals fared no better. They were skilled warriors, but skill meant little in the narrow confines of the pass. The Greek phalanx, and particularly the Spartan section of it, simply could not be broken by frontal assault. The Immortals were repulsed with heavy losses. The pass remained closed. Xerxes was now in a difficult position. He could not bypass Thermopylae by sea because the Greek fleet at Artemisium was contesting Persian naval superiority. He could not force the pass by direct assault. He could try to wait out the Greeks, but his massive army required enormous supplies, and delay would strain his logistics. He needed another solution. That solution came in the form of betrayal. A local Greek named Helots, motivated by the promise of reward, came to Xerxes and revealed the existence of a mountain path, the Anapeia Path, that wound around the pass and would allow Persian troops to descend behind the Greek position, attacking them from the rear. Xerxes immediately sent the Immortals, under their commander Hydarnes, to follow this path during the night. Their mission was to reach the rear of the Greek position by dawn and trap the defenders between two forces. If they succeeded, the brave Greek stand would end in annihilation. The Greeks had known about the Anapeia path and had stationed the 1,000 Phocians to guard it, but the Phocians were not Spartans. When the Immortals approached in the pre-dawn darkness, the Phocians heard them coming but assumed the force was heading elsewhere. When they realized they were the target, the Phocians retreated to a nearby hilltop to defend themselves. The Immortals, more interested in completing their flanking maneuver than fighting the Phocians, simply bypassed them and continued toward the rear of Thermopylae. Word of the flanking march reached Leonidas shortly after dawn. Sentries and deserters from the Persian side brought news that the Immortals were coming. The Greek commander now faced a terrible choice. Leonidas understood immediately what the Persian flanking maneuver meant. The Greek position at Thermopylae was about to become a trap. By midday, perhaps sooner, the Immortals would descend from the mountains and attack from the rear, while the main Persian force attacked from the front. The Greeks would be surrounded, unable to maintain their defensive advantages. They would be annihilated. The Spartan king called a council of the Greek leaders. What was said in that council we can only guess from the fragments recorded by later historians. But the decision that emerged was clear. Most of the Greek force would retreat south, living to fight another day. But some would remain to hold the pass as long as possible, buying time for the others to escape and for the Greek city-states to complete their preparations. Who would stay was never really in question. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans would remain. To retreat would be to violate the Spartan code so fundamentally that it was unthinkable. They had been raised from childhood to believe that retreat brought dishonor worse than death, that their shield should be returned upon them or not at all. Moreover, there was a religious dimension to their choice. An oracle had prophesied that either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king must die. Leonidas may have believed that his death here would save his city, that it was his destiny and duty to fall at Thermopylae. The 700 Thespians, led by their commander Demophilus, chose to stay as well. These men from a small city, far from the military perfection of Sparta, decided that honor meant more than survival. They had fought alongside the Spartans for 2 days and would not abandon them now. Their names are less remembered than the Spartan 300, but their courage was no less. The 400 Thebans remain as well, though accounts suggest they may have been kept by force, hostages to ensure Theban loyalty. Some would later surrender to the Persians, which was held against Thebes in the years to come. As the bulk of the Greek force withdrew south, those who remained prepared for their last battle. They knew they would die here, in this narrow pass between the mountains and the sea. They knew their bodies would lie unburied, at least initially, a terrible fate in Greek belief. But they also knew that their deaths would mean something, that the delay they provided might save Greece, that their names would be remembered. The Hella attendants of the 300 Spartans faced their own choice. They could leave, and probably no one would have blamed them. They were slaves, after all, bound to serve, but perhaps not bound to die for their master's glory. Yet many chose to stay, whether from loyalty, from fear of punishment if they fled, or from their own conception of honor, we cannot know. But when the final battle came, Helots fought alongside Spartans and died beside them. On the third day, with the Immortals now in position behind them, the Greeks in the pass prepared for their final stand. They would not wait behind their wall for the Persians to attack from 2 sides. Instead, they would attack first, carrying the fight to the enemy, dying as warriors should, facing forward with weapons in hand. In the early morning, Leonidas led his force out from the pass into the wider area beyond, where the Persians were assembling. The Greeks charged into the Persian formations with a fury born of desperation and determination. They knew they were going to die, and that knowledge made them terrifying. The Spartans fought with all the skill of their decades of training, with all the courage their culture demanded. They broke through the Persian lines repeatedly, killing commanders and sowing chaos. Xerxes' guards had to protect him as the fighting came dangerously close to the position. Persian soldiers were driven forward by their commanders, some literally whipped into battle. But even then they could not match the ferocity of men who had already accepted their deaths. The fighting was savage and personal. Spears shattered, and the Greeks drew swords. Swords broke, and they fought with their hands. Men wrestled and bit and clawed. The Greek armor gave them an advantage in close combat, protecting them from blows that would have felled Persian soldiers in their lighter gear. But slowly, inevitably, the Greeks were worn down. Leonidas fell in the thick of the fighting, killed by multiple spear thrusts. His body became the focus of a brutal struggle. The Spartans fought desperately to recover their king's corpse, refusing to let it be mutilated by the enemy. The Persians tried equally hard to capture it, knowing that parading a Spartan king's body would demoralize the Greeks. For times, the area around Leonidas' body changed hands. Finally, the surviving Spartans managed to drag their king's corpse back toward the wall. By now, the immortals had descended from a mountain and were attacking from the rear. The Greeks fell back to a small hill, the last defensible position. They formed a circle, shields outward, backs together, and prepared to make their last stand. Most of their spears were broken. Many had lost their swords. They fought with whatever they had left, and when that was gone, they fought with rocks and fists and teeth. The Persians did not dare assault the hill directly. They had learned respect for Greek warriors in close combat. Instead, they surrounded the hill and shot arrows at the Greeks from all sides. Wave after wave of arrows fell on the small circle defenders. There was no defense against this, no way to shield oneself from missiles coming from every direction. One by one, the Greeks fell. Herodotus preserves some of the names and deeds from this final stand. Dionysus, a Spartan, was told before the battle that the Persian arrows were so numerous they would blot out the sun. He replied, "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." He died on the hill, having kept his word. Alpheus and Maron, Spartan brothers, fell fighting side by side. Megistheus, a seer who predicted his own death but refused to leave, died among the Spartans, honored in death as in life. By noon it was over. Every Greek who remained in the past was dead. The Thespians had been annihilated alongside the Spartans. Some Thebans had surrendered and were branded as slaves by the Persians. The Helots lay where they had fallen, their names unrecorded but their courage undeniable. Xerxes ordered a search for Leonidas' body among the thousands of dead. When it was found, he had the head cut off and the body crucified, an act of disrespect that shocked even some Persians. It was unworthy of a king to mutilate a brave enemy, but Xerxes was apparently angered by the casualties Leonidas had inflicted. The pass was now open. The Persian army marched south into central Greece. They would burn Athens, whose citizens had evacuated the city. They would ravage the countryside, but the delay at Thermopylae had given the Greeks time to prepare. The Athenian fleet would meet the Persians at Salamis and would win a decisive naval victory. The following year, a combined Greek force would crush the Persian army at Plataea. Xerxes' invasion would fail. Whether Thermopylae was militarily decisive is debatable. 3 days of delay, while significant, was not in itself enough to change the course of the war. But the stand at Thermopylae became something more than a military action. It became a symbol, a story that Greeks told themselves about who they were and what they valued. Free men fighting for their homes had stood against an empire of slaves and had shown that courage and discipline could challenge sheer numbers. The Spartans had become legend. Their 300 had done what their entire society was designed to produce: warriors who would not retreat, who would face any odds, who would choose death with honor over life with shame. Everything we have examined about Spartan society, the harsh childhood, the brutal training, the constant discipline, the subordination of individual to state, all of it had been vindicated here in this narrow pass. Or had it? We celebrate the 300, but should we also mourn them? These were men who had been so thoroughly shaped by their society that they were capable of choosing certain death over retreat. They were brave, unquestionably, but they were also, in a sense, victims of a system that gave them no real choice, that made their decision inevitable through decades of indoctrination. The Greek poet Simonides composed an epitaph that was inscribed on a stone at Thermopylae. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." That word, obedient, is crucial. The 300 died as they had lived, obedient to Spartan law, fulfilling the role their society had assigned them. There is glory in that, but also tragedy. In the immediate aftermath, however, what mattered was the inspiration. The story of Thermopylae spread throughout Greece. It stiffened resistance to Persia. It convinced wavering city-states that the empire could be fought. It proved that Spartans were everything they claimed to be and that Greeks fighting together could challenge the greatest power in the world. For Sparta itself, Thermopylae confirmed its identity and purpose. The city had produced warriors worthy of legend. The decades of harsh training, the sacrifices demanded, the rigid social structure, all of it seemed justified by this ultimate proof of effectiveness. Sparta had shown that its way worked, that a society organized entirely around military excellence could produce results that others could only dream of achieving. But legend and reality are not the same thing. Thermopylae was a defeat, however heroic. The Persians had forced the pass and marched on. The Spartans had died gloriously, but they had also died. And while their sacrifice bought time and inspired others, it also revealed a troubling truth about Sparta. That was perhaps too willing to sacrifice its citizens, that the cult of death in battle might lead to reckless decisions, that glorifying last stands might make tactical retreats psychologically impossible. These concerns would not become fully apparent for generations. In 480 BCE, in the immediate aftermath of Thermopylae and the subsequent victories at Salamis and Plataea, Sparta stood at the height of its prestige. It was acknowledged as the premier military power of Greece, the city that had provided the leadership and sacrifice necessary to defeat Persia. Other Greek cities looked to Sparta for protection and leadership. The Spartan way seemed validated beyond any doubt. And so the city continued down the path it had chosen, doubling down on the militarism that had brought it glory. The Agoges continued to grind out warriors. The Helots continued to labor under oppression. The social structure remained rigid and unchanging. Sparta became, if anything, more Spartan, more devoted to its peculiar vision of perfection through discipline and sacrifice. What Sparta did not do was evolve, adapt, or learn from its victories. The society that had been so carefully designed to produce warriors was brilliant at that single purpose, but ill-equipped for the complexities of the world beyond the battlefield. In the decades to come, Sparta would win battles but struggle with governance, would gain an empire but not know how to manage it, would remain militarily supreme but politically inept. For now, though, Sparta basked in the glory of Thermopylae. The 300 had become immortal in song and story. Their sacrifice had saved Greece. Their courage had proved the Spartan way. The future would bring challenges that martial valor alone could not solve, but those challenges still lay ahead. The Romans were fascinated by Sparta. Roman writers, philosophers often praised Spartan discipline and simplicity, seeing in ancient Sparta a reflection of Rome's own military values. Plutarch, who lived in the 1st century CE under Roman rule, wrote his biographies of famous Spartans with admiration for their austere virtue. The Romans saw Sparta as a noble antique, a society that had valued martial honor above wealth and comfort. But this Roman admiration was tinged with condescension. Sparta was now a museum piece, a living relic of a bygone age. Roman tourists would visit to observe Spartan customs, much as modern tourists visit historical reenactments. The whipping ceremony at the altar of Artemis Orthia, once a sacred test of Spartan endurance, became a spectacle performed for foreign audiences. Theater seating was constructed around the altar so that Romans could comfortably watch boys being flogged. This commercialization of Spartan tradition was both a preservation and a perversion. The forms remained, but the substance had changed. The boys being whipped were performing for pay, demonstrating authentic Spartan toughness for entertainment. The sacred had become profane. The ritual had become theater. The test of courage had become a tourist attraction. Some Spartans apparently embraced this role, finding it a source of income and a way to maintain at least the appearance of their ancient customs. Others must have found it degrading, this reduction of their proud heritage to entertainment for foreigners. But Sparta was poor and powerless, and pride alone does not feed a population or maintain a city. The communal messes continued in some form, but they were shadows of what they had been. The Agoges persisted, but it produced mercenaries rather than citizen warriors devoted to Sparta. Young Spartans might train in the traditional manner, but then they would leave to fight in foreign armies for pay, their loyalty belonging to whoever hired them rather than to their city. The Helots who remained in Laconia were gradually freed or allowed to drift away, not through rebellion, but through economic changes that made the old system untenable. Without Messenia, without a large citizen body to support, without the political power to enforce subjugation, the Helot system simply eroded. By the Roman period, Sparta's agricultural labor force consisted of free tenant farmers and slaves of conventional type, not the distinctive Helot class that had once been so central to Spartan identity. The two royal houses continued, a remnant of the old constitution, but their power was ceremonial. The Gerousia and Ephyr still existed, but they governed a small, poor city with little influence beyond its own borders. Sparta participated in various Greek federations and alliances, but always as a minor partner, never as a leader. There were occasional moments when the old Spartan spirit seemed to flicker back to life. In 207 BCE, when the Spartan tyrant Nabis ruled the city, he implemented radical social reforms, freeing Helots, redistributing land, and building up Sparta's military strength. For a brief period, Sparta was again a power to be reckoned with in the Peloponnese. But Nabis was defeated and killed by the Achaean League with Roman support in 192 BCE, and his reforms were reversed. It was as if history kept offering Sparta chances to reform and revive, but each time, the revival was crushed by external enemies or internal resistance. The tragedy was that Sparta could neither fully embrace change nor successfully resist it. The city was caught between nostalgia for a glorious past and the reality of a diminished present, unable to move forward, but unable to return to what had been. By the 1st century BCE, when Rome was transforming from republic to empire under Augustus, Sparta was an acknowledged backwater. It had no significant economy, no political influence, no military power that mattered on a larger stage. What it had was its legend, its history, its reputation. And the Romans, who valued martial virtue even as their own society became increasingly luxurious, were willing to preserve Sparta as a symbol of old Roman values. Under Roman rule, Sparta enjoyed a kind of protected status. The Romans did not heavily tax it or interfere much in its internal affairs. They allowed Sparta to maintain its traditional institutions and customs, seeing them as valuable cultural heritage worth preserving. In return, Sparta posed no threat and caused no trouble. It was a comfortable arrangement for a city that had lost the will or ability to determine its own fate. The contrast with Athens could not have been more stark. Athens, though it too had lost its political independence, remained a cultural and intellectual center throughout the Roman period. The philosophical schools of Athens attracted students from across the Mediterranean. Athenian art and literature continued to influence the Roman world. Athens had lost its empire, but retained its cultural vitality. Sparta had only its past. The art was centuries old. The poetry belonged to archaic times. The philosophy was minimal. What Sparta offered was a spectacle of its own traditions, preserved like insects in amber, beautiful in their way, but lifeless. The very perfection that Lycurgus had supposedly achieved meant there was nothing new to create, nothing to develop, only the eternal repetition of ancient forms. And yet, there was something poignant about this preservation. In a world that was rapidly changing, that was becoming more cosmopolitan and complex, Sparta represented simplicity and clarity of purpose. In an empire where wealth and luxury were increasingly prized, Sparta represented austere virtue. In a society where traditional values were eroding, Sparta represented unwavering commitment to a code. Whether that code was good or sustainable, whether it had ever truly existed in the form claimed, these were questions that Roman admirers preferred not to examine too closely. The hollow victory was this: Sparta had won immortality through its legends, had secured a permanent place in historical memory, but only by dying. The living Sparta of the Roman period was not the Sparta of Thermopylae or Leuctra, not the city that had dominated Greece for centuries. It was a memorial to itself, a tomb that tourists visited to pay their respects to the glorious dead. And perhaps that was fitting. A society that had been so focused on death, that had praised dying in battle above all other achievements, that had taught its children that glory came from the manner of one's death rather than the accomplishments of one's life. Perhaps such a society could only achieve true perfection in death, preserve forever the moment of its greatest achievement, never aging, never disappointing, never forced to adapt to a changing world. Let's take a step back from the grand sweep of political and military history and consider what it must have been like to be a Spartan during these long centuries of decline. Imagine being born in Sparta around 300 BCE. 2 generations after Leuctra, 1 generation after the failed reforms of Aegis III. What would your life have been like? You would have been raised on stories of ancient glory. Your parents and grandparents would have told you about Thermopylae, about the great victories, about when Sparta ruled Greece, and other cities trembled at the approach of men in crimson cloaks. You would have learned that you were heir to the greatest military tradition in Greek history, descended from warriors who never retreated, never surrendered, never failed to do their duty. But you would also have looked around and seen a very different reality. The city was smaller than it had been, poorer, less populous. Many houses stood empty, their families extinct or impoverished. The training grounds where thousands once drilled now accommodated hundreds. The communal messes, once the center of Spartan social life, now struggled to maintain themselves as contributions dwindled and membership declined. If you were male, you would still have gone through the agoge or some version of it. The training would still have been harsh, designed to produce warriors of the traditional type. You had been taught to endure hardship, to fight in the phalanx, to value honor above life. But there would have been a hollowness to it, a sense that you were training for a world that no longer existed, preparing for a role that no one needed you to fill. After completing your training, what then? There were no great wars to fight, no empire to defend or expand. You might serve in the Spartan army, such as it was, defending against border raids or participating in local conflicts. Or you might leave Sparta to serve as a mercenary in one of the Hellenistic kingdoms, fighting for pay in distant lands, using your Spartan training to earn a living rather than to bring glory to your city. If you were female, you had been raised on stories of Spartan women who sent their sons to battle with stern commands, who valued honor over life, who embodied the harshness of the Spartan code. But you would have lived in a world where such extremity was no longer practical or even possible. Your sons, if you had them, might not even remain in Sparta. Your household might struggle economically in ways that earlier generations, supported by Helot labor and Claro's land, had not. You would have been caught between a glorious past that you could never recapture and a diminished present that you could never quite accept. The very identity of being Spartan was bound up with military excellence and political power. But both of those were slipping away. What did it mean to be Spartan when Sparta no longer mattered? Some Spartans responded by clinging even more tightly to tradition. If the city was weak, at least the customs could remain pure. If Sparta no longer dominated Greece, at least it could maintain the moral superiority of living according to the ancient ways. This conservatism, this refusal to adapt, was understandable as a psychological defense mechanism. If everything is changing, if everything you valued is being lost, then preserving even the forms of tradition becomes vitally important. Other Spartans, particularly those who traveled abroad or served as mercenaries, must have felt the tension between Spartan ideology and the realities of the Hellenistic world. They saw wealthy cities with vibrant cultures, saw the rewards that came from commerce and arts and sciences, saw that the Spartan way was not the only way or even necessarily the best way. Some of these men probably came home dissatisfied, critical, wanted to change Sparta, to be more like the successful cities they had visited. Wider world, listeners showing mixture of interest and discomfort with foreign ideas. This tension between traditionalists and reformers erupted periodically in conflicts like those surrounding Aegis IV and Cleomenes III. But the reformers never quite succeeded, and the traditionalists could not prevent decline. Sparta was caught in a trap of its own making. The system that had made it strong was now making it weak, but changing that system meant ceasing to be Sparta in any meaningful sense. The psychological toll of living through such decline must have been immense. The Spartans had been raised to believe they were special, superior, destined for glory. They had been taught that their way of life was the best that human wisdom could devise, sanctioned by the gods, perfected by Lycurgus. To watch that way of life fail, to see Sparta become marginal and poor, to know that the sacrifices of the agoge and hardships of Spartan life no longer produce the results they once had, this must have been devastating. Some must have lost faith entirely, abandoning Sparta physically or spiritually, embracing the values of the Hellenistic world that surrounded them. Others must have become bitter, blaming betrayal and corruption for what was really structural failure. Still others must have simply endured, maintaining the traditional forms because that was all they knew how to do, finding meaning in the preservation of custom even when that custom no longer served its original purpose. There is evidence that by the Hellenistic period, social stratification had increased dramatically in Sparta. A small elite of wealthy families controlled most of the land and held most of the power. The majority of citizens had become poor, struggling to maintain even the basic requirements of citizenship, the equality that had supposedly defined Spartan society. That homoioi status that meant equals had become a fiction. Sparta had developed the same inequalities that plagued other Greek cities, but without the economic dynamism or cultural vitality that those other cities possessed. The Helot population, no longer so rigidly controlled, had also changed, with Messenia independent and the Spartan citizen body too small to enforce the old terror. The relationship between Spartans and the remaining Helots became less antagonistic out of necessity. There is evidence of Helots serving alongside Spartans in later conflicts, even being promised freedom from military service. The sharp distinction between free and enslaved was blurring, another sign that the old system was eroding. This long decline, stretching over centuries, was in some ways harder than a sudden catastrophic defeat would have been. A sudden end might have been dramatic but clean, a final heroic stand followed by extinction. Instead, Sparta lingered on, gradually losing what made it distinctive, slowly transforming into just another small Greek city, different only in its claims to a glorious past. And yet, people continued to live there, to raise families, to find joy and meaning in their lives even as their city declined. They celebrated festivals and honored the gods. They told stories and sang songs. They loved their children and mourned their dead. Life went on as it always does, even in the shadow of lost glory. The long decline teaches us something important about historical memory and human resilience. Societies do not usually end with a bang, but with a whimper, with gradual erosion rather than sudden collapse. People adapt to diminished circumstances, finding ways to maintain dignity and meaning even when the grand narratives of their culture are no longer supported by reality. The Spartans of the later periods were not less human or less worthy than their ancestors at Thermopylae, but they faced a harder task of living without the certainty and purpose that the earlier system had provided. Perhaps there's a kind of courage in that, too. Not the dramatic courage of standing in the phalanx against impossible odds, but the quieter courage of continuing to live, to maintain one's values and identity, even when history has moved on and your moment of greatness has passed. Move forward with me now to the late Roman period, to the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. Sparta still exists, but it is barely recognizable as the city that once terrified Greece. Walk with me through its streets, and let us see what remains. The city has been partially Romanized. There are Roman baths here, temples that blend Greek and Roman styles, Latin inscriptions alongside Greek. The population is diverse now, not just Spartans but Greeks from other regions, Roman colonists, merchants, travelers. The fierce insularity that once defined Sparta has long since faded. The city that once banned foreigners now depends on them for its economy. The old social structure has crumbled almost entirely. There are still people who claim descent from the old Spartiate families, who trace their lineage to the warriors of Thermopylae or the kings of legend. But these claims mean little in practical terms. The communal messes, the syssitia, still exist in some form, but they are clubs or social organizations rather than the crucial institutions they once were. Men eat together out of custom and nostalgia, not because the city requires it. The agoge continues, remarkably. Boys still undergo training, still learn to endure hardship, still are educated in the Spartan manner. But it is a pale shadow of what it was. The training is less harsh, the discipline less absolute, and when their training ends, these young men do not become citizen warriors devoted to Sparta. They become whatever they wish, pursuing trades or traveling abroad or settling down to unremarkable lives. The agoge has become a form of education, a rite of passage, rather than the total transformation of boys into weapons that it had once been. The ritual whipping at Artemis Orthia's altar draws crowds. Romans and Greeks from other cities come to watch boys endure the lash, to see for themselves the famous Spartan toughness. There is an arena now, stadium seating, concessions probably. The sacred has become spectacle. The tests of courage have become entertainment. Some of the boys performing this ritual may take pride in maintaining tradition. Others probably do it for the money or the attention. Either way, it is performance, not the genuine article. What do the ghosts think? If ghosts exist and watch over their former city, imagine the shade of Leonidas, returning to see what had become of Sparta. He died defending. He would find a city that remembers him. Certainly, his name is spoken with reverence, his story told and retold. But he would also find a city that has abandoned almost everything he fought for. The discipline, the sacrifice, the willingness to die for the state, all of it has faded into legend and performance. Or imagine a Helot from the time before Leuctra, one who died under Spartan oppression, returning to see what became of the system that enslaved him. He would find that the Helots are gone, freed or assimilated or simply vanished into history. The system that once seemed eternal, that had lasted for centuries, had ended not with revolution, but with slow erosion. His descendants, if they can be traced, might be free farmers or might have left Laconia entirely, pursuing lives their ancestor could never have imagined. The Spartan kings still exist, though their power is entirely symbolic now. They perform ceremonies, represent the city in dealings with Roman authorities, embody continuity with the past. But they do not lead armies, do not make policy decisions of consequence, do not shape history. They are living monuments. Their primary function to remind people that Sparta was once something great. The countryside of Laconia shows the scars of centuries of warfare and decline. Villages that once thrived are abandoned. Fields that once produced abundant crops lie fallow or are worked by a diminished population. The Eurotas River still flows through the valley, but the prosperity that once lined its banks has faded. The mountains still surround the valley, eternal and unchanging, indifferent to human glory and human decline. There is a philosophical question embedded in all this decline. Was Sparta's brief period of glory worth the centuries of mediocrity that followed? If you could somehow calculate the total human happiness and suffering across all of Spartan history, would the balance be positive or negative? The warriors who died at Thermopylae achieved immortal fame, but does that compensate for the countless boys who suffered through the Agoge, the Helots who lived and died in subjugation, the women who suppressed natural maternal feelings in service to an unforgiving code? Different philosophers would answer differently. The Stoics, who admired Spartan discipline, might say that virtue and duty are their own rewards, that a life of softness and comfort is less human than a life of hardship and excellence. The Epicureans, who value pleasure and peace, might say that Sparta was a cautionary tale, proof that excessive discipline and constant warfare lead only to suffering. The Christians, whose religion was spreading through the Roman Empire during this period, would have seen Sparta through yet another lens. The Christian emphasis on mercy, on loving one's enemies, on caring for the weak, was fundamentally incompatible with Spartan values. A society that exposed weak infants, that terrorized its slave population, that celebrated death in battle above all else. Such a society would have seemed profoundly unchristian. And yet, Christian writers sometimes praise Spartan self-discipline and communal devotion, seeing in them echoes of monastic ideals. Sparta in the late Roman period was a place of ghosts and echoes. The glorious past was everywhere present in memory and nowhere visible in reality. The city lived on its reputation, sustained itself through the tourism of curious Romans and nostalgic Greeks who wanted to see where history had been made. It was a living museum, preserving the forms of a vanished civilization. And yet, life continued. Children were born and grew and had children of their own. People fell in love, celebrated weddings, mourned deaths. Farmers planted and harvested. Merchants bought and sold. Festivals were celebrated, though perhaps their original meanings were half forgotten. The daily texture of human life, with its small joys and sorrows, its routines and disruptions, continue regardless of historical significance. Perhaps this is the most important thing to remember about Sparta's long twilight, that it was populated by real people, not just by symbols or lessons for historians to draw upon. These people were the inheritors of a complex legacy, burdened by impossible expectations, living in the shadow of ancestors they could never equal. Some probably felt this burden acutely, felt themselves failures because they could not live up to the standard of Thermopylae. Others probably shrugged it off, lived their lives as best they could, and left the glorious past to the historians and philosophers. The Roman Empire itself would eventually fall, of course. In the 3rd century CE, crises shook the empire. In the 4th century, Christianity became the official religion. In the 5th century, the Western Empire collapsed under barbarian invasions. Through all of this, Sparta endured in its diminished state, sometimes sacked by invaders, sometimes rebuilding, always surviving in some form. By the medieval period, the ancient city was largely abandoned. The population moved to nearby Mistras, a Byzantine fortress city built on a hillside. Ancient Sparta became ruins, columns, and foundations, stones overgrown with vegetation. The Eurotas still flowed, the mountains still stood, but the human settlement that had once been Sparta existed only in memory and in the stories that people told. And those stories, it turns out, would prove more durable than any bronze or stone. And now, gently, slowly, return with me to the present. Feel yourself rising up through the centuries, through the medieval period when Sparta was ruins, through the Renaissance when scholars rediscovered classical texts, through the Enlightenment when philosophers debated Spartan virtue, through the modern era when nations looked to Sparta for inspiration or warning. We stand now in the 21st century, more than 2,000 years removed from Thermopylae, and yet Sparta still resonates. Movies are made about Spartan warriors. Books are written about Spartan discipline. Military academies teach Spartan tactics. The word Spartan itself has entered our language, meaning austere, disciplined, rigorously simple. The echo of ancient Sparta still reverberates through time. But what exactly are we hearing in that echo? What is the lesson of Sparta for our own time? Some hear in Sparta a celebration of martial virtue, of courage and discipline, and willingness to sacrifice for a greater cause. They admire the Spartans' refusal to surrender, their devotion to duty over comfort, their creation of a society that valued excellence over pleasure. In a world that can seem soft and self-indulgent, the Spartan example suggests that humans are capable of extraordinary feats when they organize themselves rigorously and subordinate individual desires to communal goals. Others hear in Sparta a warning about the cost of militarism, of what happens when society organizes itself entirely around warfare and violence. They see the oppression of the Helots, the regimentation of citizens, the suppression of art and philosophy, and individual creativity. They note that Sparta contributed little to human civilization beyond the art of war, that its glory was brief and its decline was long, that its much-vaunted system ultimately failed to adapt and survive. Both interpretations contain truth. Sparta genuinely did achieve something remarkable in creating the most formidable military force of classical Greece. The discipline and courage of Spartan warriors were real, not propagandistic fiction. The stand at Thermopylae was genuinely heroic, genuinely important in defending Greek freedom against Persian imperialism. But that achievement came at enormous human cost. The Helots suffered for centuries under Spartan domination. Spartan children were subjected to a brutal educational system that modern societies would consider child abuse. Spartan citizens lived regimented lives that offered little room for individual flourishing or personal freedom. And in the end, the entire elaborate system collapsed, unable to adapt to changing circumstances, leaving Sparta powerless and poor. Perhaps the deepest lesson of Sparta is about the danger of perfecting a system, of creating a society so carefully tuned to a specific purpose that it cannot evolve. The Spartans believed they had found the perfect way to organize society, given to them by Lycurgus, sanctioned by the gods, eternal and unchangeable. This belief made them rigid, made adaptation feel like betrayal, made reform feel like corruption. But the world changes. Warfare evolves. Economic systems shift. New ideas emerge. A society that cannot adapt will eventually be left behind, no matter how perfectly it is designed for the circumstances that created it. This is what happened to Sparta. The system that dominated Greece in the 5th century BC was obsolete by the 3rd century BCE, but the Spartans could not or would not change it fundamentally enough to survive. There is also a lesson about the relationship between ends and means. The Spartans organized their society to produce military excellence, and they succeeded. But in doing so, they sacrificed almost everything else that makes life rich and meaningful: art, philosophy, individual freedom, family life, economic prosperity. They became brilliant at warfare, but incompetent at almost everything else. When warfare alone could no longer solve their problems, They had no other tools to use. Modern societies face different, but related challenges. We must balance security with freedom, collective good with individual rights, tradition with adaptation. We must maintain discipline and order without becoming rigid and oppressive. We must defend ourselves without organizing our entire society around warfare. We must change and adapt without losing our core values and identity. Sparta shows us both what is possible through discipline and sacrifice, and what is lost when those become the only values. It shows us the glory and the tragedy of society that chose one path so completely that it could not turn back. And what of the individual Spartans, the millions who lived and died over the centuries of Spartan history? What should we remember about them? They were humans like us, capable of courage and cruelty, of love and violence, of nobility and oppression. They were shaped by their society as we are shaped by ours, accepting as normal what their culture taught them was right. They experienced the full range of human emotions, even when their culture demanded that they suppress those emotions in service to the state. The warrior dying at Thermopylae, standing in the phalanx until the end, was genuinely brave. But he was also a product of decades of conditioning, a man who had been taught from age 7 that death with honor was preferable to life with shame. Can we admire his courage while also acknowledging the system that created him was profoundly flawed? I think we must. The Spartan mother sending her son to battle with stern words was maintaining the values of her culture. But she also, surely, felt the normal human fear for her child's safety, the normal maternal love that every culture recognizes. The facade of hardness required by Spartan culture did not erase her humanity, only forced her to hide it. The Helot laboring in the fields, living under the constant threat of violence, was as much a Spartan as a citizen warrior, in the sense that the Spartan system could not have existed without him. His suffering was a foundation on which Spartan glory was built. We should remember him, too, even though history recorded few of their names. As you drift now toward sleep, toward rest, toward the quiet darkness where consciousness fades, carry with you these images from ancient Sparta. The valley of Laconia, surrounded by mountains, where the strange experiment in human organization took place. The boys enduring harsh training, learning to be warriors. The Helots working the land, dreaming perhaps of freedom. The warriors standing in the phalanx, shields locked, facing death without flinching. The women managing households, bearing children, maintaining the system through their own sacrifices. Carry with you the understanding that history is not simple, that the societies we study were not cartoons or moral fables, but complex human organizations full of real people making difficult choices. Sparta achieved something extraordinary and paid an extraordinary price for it. We can learn from both the achievement and the price. And carry with you, finally, the awareness that all human glory is temporary. The warriors of Thermopylae achieved immortal fame, but Sparta itself fell into ruin. The system that seemed eternal lasted only a few centuries. The mountains that witnessed Spartan history remain, but the city is gone, its stones scattered, its story surviving only in the writings of those who observed it from outside. Nothing human lasts forever. Empires rise and fall. Civilizations flourish and fade. The works of our hands crumble into dust. But the stories remain, passing from generation to generation, teaching us about ourselves, about what humans can achieve and what they can endure, about the eternal struggle between the ideals we aspire to and the flawed realities we create. Sparta's echo through time is the echo of all human endeavor, all human achievement, all human tragedy. It reminds us that we are capable of extraordinary things, but that every choice has consequences, that every system has costs, that perfection is an illusion and adaptation is survival. The valley of Laconia is quiet now. The Eurotas flows as it always has. The mountains stand unchanged. Where once warriors trained and battles raged, now there are only stones and memories. But those memories carry weight, carry meaning, carry lessons for those willing to listen. Close your eyes. Let the ancient world fade back into the past where it belongs. Feel yourself returning to your own time, your own place, your own life. The story of Sparta is over, finished more than 1,000 years ago, but its echo remains, whispering to us across the centuries about courage and cruelty, about glory and decline, about the price we pay for the choices we make. Rest now. Sleep peacefully. The warriors of Thermopylae have been dead for more than 2,000 years, their struggles long over, their pain and fear and courage all passed into memory. They lived, they fought, they died, and they are remembered. Perhaps it is all any of us can hope for, to live as fully as we can, to face what we must face with courage, and to leave behind stories worth telling. Sleep well, dream of ancient battles, or do not dream at all. The history remains, the lessons remain, the echo remains, and tomorrow, when you wake, you will carry with you a deeper understanding of one of history's most fascinating and troubling societies, of Sparta, the city of warriors, the experiment in discipline, the brief flame that burned so brightly and left such long shadows. The story is told. The journey is complete. Rest now in the quiet darkness, and let the ancient world slip back into the past where it belongs, leaving you only with understanding, with perspective, with the wisdom that comes from walking through history and returning safely home. Good night.